Hello world, and we are back. My name is Kyle Fischl. This is going to be episode 184 of my poker vlog. For this one, I play a 1-3 deep stack game at the Sarasota Florida One-Eyed Jack's poker room. I have a ton of hands to go over, so we're going to get right into it. First hand of note. We start at the 1-2 table waiting for the 1-3 deep stack game. We look down at pocket sevens from the button. When we button straddle, we get 3 limpers, raise it up to $15. 2 of the limpers decide to call, so we end up going 3 ways to a flop of 9-4 deuce rainbow. With only 1 overcard, we're definitely going to bet here. Sevens benefits greatly by protecting against like king, queen, jack 10, bunch of random overcards, and it's hard for my opponents to have just a random 9. So when it checks to me, I throw out a bet of $30. I am expecting to actually win this hand a decent proportion of the time, but a late position player decides to call the $30, which I'm pretty much not happy to see. I think he always has a 9 minimum here, but maybe none of that matters because the turn is the 7 of diamonds. When my opponent checks to me, I think it's hard to get all 3 streets if my opponent had just a single 9. So we're going to go for a check here to either induce on the river, or we can happily value bet river when checked to. When I check, the river is the 6 of hearts, and now my opponent bets $40. He has roughly 120 behind, which I think limits my options to either jam or call. When we think about jamming, I don't really see a 9 calling a jam, but the obvious draw out there of 5-3 gets there. So thinking my opponent only calls with like 2 pair plus and made straights, and not seeing a whole lot of 2 pair combinations that are possible, I choose to just call this one, and my opponent has 9-8 offsuit. So maybe would have called a raise, probably not for a jam size. Maybe exploitatively you can go like, I don't know, 95 and hope that he calls an extra $50, but we do start out the game profitable at the 1-2 streets before we add up a little bit. Now we're into the game for $800 at the 1-3 deep stack game, 1K max. Got a pretty bad seat for the filming portion of this, but we're just going to let it ride. I'm in the small blind with king, queen of hearts with 2 limps. I raise it up to $22. A little bit bigger. We're going to play out of position for the whole hand, so would like to thin the field. Only a single middle position player decides to call, who's across from me. So we're heads up to a flop of ace 7-7 with 1 heart. I'm just going to keep betting here. I have the best aces. When he limp calls, he can never really have ace jack plus all too often. So I bet $25. Unfortunately for me, my opponent decides to call. It's not the worst sign. He would still have like 8s, 9s, 10s, 5s, 6s, plenty of pocket pairs that are going to fold to the second barrel. So when the 3 of clubs peel off, I'm going to continue telling the story that I have a strong ace. Hopefully a bet of $55 gets all those middling pocket pairs to fold. Maybe the weakest aces of like ace 2, ace 3, which is irrelevant, 4 and 5. Maybe those hands fold as well, thinking my kicker's always going to be better. But my opponent calls again. When the river is the jack of hearts, we river a 4-card royal. So that's kind of fun. But I do think the story's up. When my opponent calls twice, I think he just has a random 7. He's a limp caller, so I check, just giving up. My opponent bets $130, and 2 barrels into the abyss turn into dust, and we start out the 1-3 table, not on the best note. After that, I look down at ace-king offsuit in early position. I raise to $15. A middle position player and the small blind decide to call, so we end up going 3 ways to a flop of king 7-10 all diamonds. Without having a diamond in my hand, I think the best play here is to bet small or check. This time I choose to check. I'm somewhat out of position here. Don't really want to get blown off my hand if I bet and get raised. I'm in a very dicey spot. A bet doesn't accomplish a whole lot here because all single diamonds are probably going to call. 10x with a diamond. King, jack, no diamonds might call. So that's one of the hands we can get value from. But as played, we choose to check this one. And it checks all the way through. The turn is the 7 of hearts, pairs the board. Now I think my hand functions better as a bet. If my opponent had a single diamond, he's going to be less inclined to raise as there are full house possibilities. I could have pocket kings here some of the time and play it the same way. And we definitely want to get value from worst kings, some single diamond holding, some 10s with a diamond. So I throw out a bet of $15. Only my nemesis from the last hand decided to call, so we're heads up to a river card, which I'm praying isn't a diamond, but this time it is. The 5 of diamonds. My opponent checks to me, and I do not snap check this one back. I think about it. I think that there are some kings that will pay off a small bet here. I don't really think a 9 or an 8 plus of diamonds is ever folding, so it is kind of dicey. Maybe I get a 6 and lower to fold at least some portion of the time. But as played, I think I played this hand pretty well. I've controlled the size of the pot. I have top pair, top kicker. Somewhat of a dicey run out, so we decide to check this one back. Realize our showdown value, and it is nothing, as my opponent announces high hand and shows pocket sevens. So that one is one we cannot beat and would never have folded to a river bet. I suppose on the bright side, we do get a $50 table share bonus of the high hand, so we actually made like $15 on this hand. Next interesting hand. I looked down at 7-6 of clubs. I button straddle, and with 2 limps, I raise it up to $15. Only one of the middle position players decide to call the raise, so we are heads up to a flop of ace 7-3 all spades. So we're consistent with the monotone boards. I decided to play passively on the flop the last time. This time I'm going to bet small here. I think checking or betting small are both viable when you flop a pair on a monotone board. So this time I bet $10. Hopefully my opponent just missed. Should not be too many strong aces in a limp caller's range. So if my opponent has like king, queen, no spade, they're probably going to just fold. And I definitely like folding out all the overcard equity. But to the $10 bet, my opponent decides to call, so we are heads up to a turn card, which is the 7 of hearts. Ooh, 3 of a kind's pretty nice. Hopefully he has a random ace. When he checks to me, I choose to bet $20. Think all aces are calling, all single spades. Very similar to the last hand, so $20 is the wager, and my opponent calls again. All right, dealer. You made a 4 flush last board. You couldn't possibly do it again. I was certainly surprised to see the 5 of spades on the river, and my opponent checks to me. This time also, I think about going for some thin value, deciding if an ace no spade's going to pay me off, and I decide that this punt's been pretty tight. I don't see myself getting 3 streets from an ace on a 4 flush board, so I settle on a check back, and immediately when I check, my opponent says, shit, and then flips over king 9 of spades. So flops the actual nuts, gets 2 bets out of me. I did turn some outs, but it is simply never a good sign when you check river and your opponent just snap curses. Ugh. Next hand of note. I am in the big blind. The under the gun player raises to $15. The +1 calls. Getting a decent price in the big blind, I decide to complete, and we end up going 3 ways to a flop of Jack 10-9 rainbow. Well, that's pretty good, I'd say. 2 pairs should be the best hand a decent portion of the time. The under the gun player continues for $20, and the +1 player is all in for $95. After I get a count, I don't think this opponent has a straight all too often. I think pair plus straight draw is much more likely, or just top pair. He had been shoving a few times, so never really going to fold 2 pair here. I decide to make the call. I'm quite shocked to see the under the gun player call as well. I think a jam and a call looks really, really strong, so he must have a really good hand or a strong draw to be able to overcall this. Either way, we are 3 ways to a turn card, 1 all in, dry side pot, and we see the king of spades on the turn. I would have bet small on pretty much any card that wasn't a king, queen, 8. Even a 7, I'd probably throw in a small bet here, but the king is just so devastating. I expect my opponent to have like queen, jack, queen 10, and even ace queen at some frequencies. So additionally, even having to beat the all-in player, I think bluffing here is very bad. You're only getting called by the queen and sometimes better 2 pairs and sets. So I check, somewhat planning on just giving up if I face a bet, but my under the gun player decides to check it back. River is the queen of hearts. Why wouldn't it be?
No.
Flop 2 pair, runner straight on board. I check, and the under the gun player bets $15. That's right, 15 into over 300. I think most people would just flick this in and then lose, but I just never expect my opponent to even bluff for 15. I suppose it's a good play, risk only 15 to get someone out of a 3-way chop, but again, you still have to beat the all-in player, so bluffing seems unnecessary because you can get me out of the pot and the all-in player could just have a random ace some of the time, but I just fold, and the other gun player had pocket aces, so had 2 of them, +1 had king jack, so in hindsight, if it goes 20-95 and I just rip all in on the flop, under the gun probably folds, but I still just lose to the all-in player. So hindsight, calling or raising doesn't change anything. Sometimes you just get bad runouts. Next hand of note. I'm in the big blind. I have 5-3 of hearts. With a button straddle, I limp, 2 other players limp. The button makes it 15, kind of a small sizing. I call, the 2 other players call. So we are going 4 ways to a flop, which comes ace, queen, 4, rainbow with 1 heart. Checks to the button, who's the pre-flop aggressor. He continues for $20. Kind of a small sizing. For this price, I think I can peel one. Can put a lot of pressure on him on a 6, 7, deuce, 3, heart. I think my hand has plenty of playability, so when I call, the other 2 players fold, and we are heads up to a turn card, which is the 4 of hearts. Now is where the hand gets interesting. I decide that this is a card that I'm going to lead on. The thought being, my opponent almost always has an ace or a queen here. He hasn't put a whole lot of money in here, so I don't think he really wants to bet a lot. And in the big blind, a limp caller, I could easily have a 4. And as the board plays, I could have 4 or 5 of diamonds. Or really just any 4 that doesn't feel like folding to just a flop C bet from the button. So I decided to lead for $60. Trying to rep a 4. If I'm called, I can hit a heart. I can hit a deuce. Plenty of outs for this semi-bluff. When my opponent calls, none of them hit, but I hit the 5 of diamonds. I think a lot of people here would look at the hand and say, I have showdown value now, and an ace probably isn't going to fold. But I think I'm telling a very specific story that I have a 4, possibly 4-5, so we're going to load up the clip and put this 5-3 into a bluff. Also, if I have 5-3 of hearts here, I guess I have 3 deuce of hearts here sometimes as well. So I decided to fire for $130. I really need this bluff to work because all the times I've had hands today, they've run into bigger hands. So would love to get this bluff through. And after a decently long tank, my opponent does fold. So we get a massive lead, continue on the river. Very fancy play syndrome, but this time it pays off. I win a few smaller pots to move me in the right direction before I'm in the big blind with Jack 10 of spades. Under the gun race to 15 versus an under the gun player. I think a 3-bet would be quite a mistake. They have the tightest range in general. So we're going to add a pretty strong hand into our calling range from the big blind. When I call, we are heads up to a flop, which comes king, queen, queen, rainbow, 1 spade. Seems really good for me. Flopping open-ended, I'd say, is above average. However, this board should connect with the under the gun raiser's range quite a bit. I check, preparing to check call, but my opponent checks it back. When he checks back, I rule out a lot of queens, a lot of king X. Maybe he has a middling pocket pair or some ace highs. But the turn is the 5 of spades. We turn a flush draw. We are never checking here. First act, we have so much equity, but only jack high. So we're going to go 2/3 on this one. I bet $20 into the $30 pot. My opponent makes the call, and I'm hoping to connect just 1 single time. Been missing a lot of draws lately, and this time we do hit. We hit the ace of clubs on the river. What a beautiful sight. We have a straight, and I think that if my opponent had an ace X hand, we can go for some value here pretty happily. So I fire $45 into the middle, and my opponent doesn't take too long before raising to $135.
I feel terrible.
Oh, this is such a stupid spot. Bet when you make a straight and you get raised on a paired board. Think about what my opponent could have here. I think unless he has exactly ace queen, not too many full houses make sense here. I think pocket kings would have just gone for some value and hoped I had a queen and gone for the max. Maybe even raise turn, not river. King queen probably raises turn as well. You know, 1 street of pot control with so much board locked up, but then I bet big on turn, so you would start piling money if you had king queen, I think. Pocket aces probably bet flop, get value from a king X and my exact holding of like jack 10. So not too many full houses that I'm worried about. I do think that queen jack, queen 10, all the other queens do go for some value here on the river. I think maybe ace king does a creative bluff here some of the time. My opponent is definitely not a nit, so I do think he could be going for actual value with like ace 10, ace jack, top pair plus straight blocker. So I don't really think too long before making the call. I have a straight. It should be good a lot of the time. Just not this time. My opponent does have pocket aces. I hit a straight. He hits a full house. He gets his raise paid off. And this one is going to be good for him. Next hand of note, and this one is very interesting. I have king queen offsuit in the button. I button straddle to $5. Early position makes it 15. 1 middle position player calls. Offsuit, I think this should be a call versus a 3-bet. Suited, much more likely to 3-bet. But when I call this one, we go 3 ways to a king 6-3 2-diamond board. When the pre-flop aggressor continues for 20, I'm not too worried about too many hands. I do have the king of diamonds to block some of the highest flushes, so not too worried about needing to protect my hand. So when the middle position player folds, I decide to make the call. Turn is the deuce of hearts. Not my favorite. 4-5 gets there, but I don't really expect him to have it all too much. He's an early position raiser over a straddler. Not too many players have 4-5 in that range. But my opponent continues for $40. Think ace-king is possible here some of the time, but I also think king-jack, king-10, middling pocket pairs, and diamond draws all play the same way. So being ahead of a lot of that, we're going to make the call a second time. The river is the ace of diamonds. Quite an interesting one, especially when my opponent checks to me. When he checks on this river, I think we can safely rule out flushes. I think flushes just go for 3 streets. Bet their draw, bet their draw, bet their flush. I think ace-king probably bets this river at least some of the time. Not always. Sometimes they go for a check call on the river, but a lot of people just bet this river when they make 2 pair. So I've been saying I'm trying to go for some thinner value in the recent videos, and this is going to be the time where I pull the trigger. I think that king-queen is better than king-jack, king-10, and I do think they'll call a bet at least some of the time. Middling pocket pairs might be disbelievers, thinking this ace is a bad card and I could be bluffing. So I'm going to bet small here, try to entice all of those hands to continue. I bet $55. My opponent does not look happy at all. He starts thinking for about 20 seconds, really hems and haws. And at this point, I'm hoping for a call. I really think that I pinned my opponent's hand exactly, going for some good and high level thin value. When my opponent eventually calls, I just flip my hand. I think it's good. And my opponent has ace-10 offsuit, both black. So I guess my analysis of this hand didn't account for the fact that he could just be bluffing 2 streets with absolutely no connectivity to the board whatsoever and then bang a 3-outer. Suppose I forgot to add that in and that cost me a $55 river bet. That one hurt. We win 2 smaller ones to move us back in the right direction before we get to the vlogger optimal seat. I look down at ace-jack of clubs. I raise to $15 after 1 player limps. The limper is the only caller. We're heads up to 7-4-3 with 2 clubs. When it checks to me, we're just going to bet big here. We have a flush draw, we have overs, but not necessarily a made hand yet. So we bet $20. My opponent decides to call. On the 10 of diamonds turn, I think this is a pure 2-barrel spot. A 7's going to have a tough time hanging on, thinking that a 3rd barrel's coming. Even a random 5, 4, 5, 6, 7. All those hands are going to have a tough time. And when called, I can just hit a club or an overcard and win. So I continue for $50. Definitely going to throw the 3rd barrel in if my opponent calls, but they fold. We take one down. Feel good about this one, winning with ace high. Another smaller one goes my way before I look down at queen 9 of spades from the button straddle. Small blind limps, big blind makes it 20. I call, the small blind calls as well. We are 3 ways to a flop of jack 10 deuce 2 clubs 1 spade. It checks to me, and when the pre-flop aggressor checks, I expect him to have a lot of ace highs, a lot of middling pocket pairs, some misses, maybe some 10s some of the time. I'm not trying to bet flop with my draws 100% of the time, so this is going to be one of the times where I check and try to realize. When I check, the turn is the 10 of hearts, and both players check to me a second time. When checked to twice, I don't think they ever have a jack. A 10 probably bets as well, as there's plenty of draws to protect against. So we're going to go a little over pot with this one, because if I had a 10 myself, I would definitely bet big, trying to protect against all the massive amount of draws that are available out there. So I bet $65. Only the big blind decides to call, and we are heads up to a river card, which is the 4 of diamonds. When deciding if I'm going to bluff here, first thing to think about is, does my opponent ever have a really good made hand? And my answer is no. I don't think a 10 or a jack ever plays this way. So thinking he has a pair under a 10, or maybe some ace high, king high clubs that missed, I don't think a big bluff size here makes a whole lot of sense. If I had a 10, I would try to pick a sizing that I know is going to get called, as it is almost surely the best hand. Additionally, not really trying to get a strong hand to fold here leads me to a sizing of $65. Same bet as the turn. Think it looks milky, thinks it looks like I have a 10, but maybe not. My opponent snap calls with ace king. Well, that one didn't work. I think just based on the 1 chip snap, he was going to call any sizing anyway, just made up his mind on the brick river. So I think the small sizing saves some money in the long run, but But I don't know. Let me know what you think the sizing should be in the comments below on this one. The very next shuffle, I look down at ace queen of spades with a button straddle. The same player raises to 20. I'm 3-betting this one. This time it's going to be $65. I have a hand this time. Let's go. The button folds, and then the small blind goes all in for approximately 900. Well, facing a 4-bet, I think ace queen's named the parking lot hand for a reason. I feel like a lot of people who would be tilting would just call off here, but I've never really seen this guy 4-bet. This might be the first 3-bet I've done of the day. Yes, the dynamics of just being caught bluffing and then 3-betting, I think, add into this dynamic, but I've been playing with this player for a bit, and he had never 4-bet before this time, and it's all in, so I guess I'll just fold here, and maybe I'm a nit, maybe I did the right fold. Not really super sure on this one, but that's fine. We win a decent sized pot before we look down at ace king offsuit. All right, we're gonna bring something back here. With a button straddle, there are 3 callers. I raised to 30. This is actually a little bit small. I think I can go like 40 or 45 with all the limpers out there, but 30 is what I chose at the time. Clearly, it is small, as 5 different players decide to call. We end up going 6 ways to a flop of jack 8-5 with 2 clubs. When it checks to me, ace king is a good hand. I put a lot of money in while I had the best hand, but into 5 other opponents, I think it's pretty crazy to throw out a c-bet here. So I check, plans to just give up, but it checks through, and the turn is the ace of diamonds.
Fun begins.
Well, we should have the best hand here a decent portion of the time. It checks to me a second time. While I've been caught bluffing, my image is garbage at this point, so I guess we're going to bet small and hopefully get paid by a jack or 9-10, queen 10, king queen. A lot of stuff that can pay me for a small sizing. So I bet $55, but one by one, every single player folds. And honestly, that's fine with me. We win a hand, we move towards the right direction. We win another one, gain some momentum before a final hand of note. I'm in early position with queen 10 of clubs. I raise to $15. Similarly to the last hand, 5 different players call. This game is definitely out of the muck. So we're going 6 ways to a flop, which comes queen 5-4 2 spades. The big blind decides to donk bet for 25, and in general, I would say the donk leads from early position on a board like this is like always a spade draw. It's always like 2 spades or 6-7 or some kind of weak draw that's trying to name their price because the pot's pretty big. They want to be able to see a turn, and we're having none of that. We have a queen. A raise here I think is going to look super strong. Hopefully I can isolate this person who I've identified probably has a draw, and we'll have a pretty easy time navigating this hand as we go forward. So I raised to $80, and that plan does not work as my nemesis for the day 3-bets the flop to $250. We get 2 folds. The big blind who donk led folds because of course he's going to. And now it's on me. Unfortunately for me in this hand, as I identified, the early position player probably has 2 spades or a 6-7 or some kind of draw. I think it heavily reduces the chances that this 3-bet could ever be a draw. Whereas I made it 15, it goes call, this player calls as well. He could easily have pocket 4s, pocket 5s, 4-5. I don't think he has a better queen, but all those smaller cards seem to smash him, and sets would definitely 3-bet here as it is a draw heavy board and I raised. And so I don't know, thinking that my opponent's weighted towards a made hand versus a draw, only having a queen, no real kicker. Feels bad to lose $80 to raise and then fold, but I just don't ever think I have more than like a 10% chance to win at best at this point. So I just fold, and my opponent's nice enough to show me 6-3 of spades. So one of the very few combo draws that are possible. He says he would have been happy to get it in, and I agree, I would have been happy to get in if I had that hand as well. So definitely closer to a 50-50, but I'd say the advantage is definitely for the 6-3 of spades. On this day, we are into the game for $800. We leave $360 for our opponents to have. That means we lost $72 an hour or 24 big blinds an hour. If you have any interest in tracking your stats a little more seriously, you use the Bink app. It's the one I use, and there's a discount code in the link below. Otherwise, even though this session was a loss, I'm glad it was a relatively small one. Sometimes when I lose, I go off the rails, lose 2 or 3 buy-ins, just try to get it back. But this one was kind of just a grind, plus some, down some, and unfortunately we ended with more losing hands than winning hands. Most notably, flop 2 pair, get runner, 5-liner. That's going to be tough. Semi-bluff with a straight draw. Hit my straight where my opponent makes a full house. That one's also going to be expensive, but do have a fun one coming up next. 2-5 deeper game, so stay on the lookout for that. And thank you. I will see you on the next one.